Welcome to this recording of the Using Alternative Provision module, which is from a core suite of resources that are being developed as part of the Behaviour Hubs program. My name is John Dabro. I'm one of the advisors on the program, and prior to this position, I was a head for over 30 years in a number of provisions for youngsters experiencing social, emotional, mental health difficulties, which manifested itself in many ways in very challenging behaviour. And can I say right from the outset that my firm belief is that the most effective APs, or alternative provisions, enhance the life chances of children. I think they can get them back on track in the education system, but also make some inroads into ameliorating some of their difficulties in the longer sense and the wider sense of their lives. Okay, so the learning outcomes for this recording. In a nutshell, it's to help you to learn about our AP, how and when you should use them, how to effectively work with AP providers, what to look for in effective provision, and to make you aware, I think in some ways, aware of your compliance and statutory responsibilities, increasing that when schools use AP, they're being asked to be more accountable for using them as it should be. And can I say, with that in mind, that the days where we sent children to AP or pupil referral units, as they were known previously, are long gone, thankfully. And now we refer children. We should be saying to children, you're going to be sent to AP as a punishment. We should be saying, we need to find another way of you managing your behaviour, or we're going to help find a new way of managing your behaviour. Therefore, we're going to refer you to alternative provision. And the bottom line is, you can't actually force children to attend pupil referral units or APs, and APs don't have to take children who are referred to them. There's that part of the law changed a few years ago. Okay, so why engage with AP? I think at the end of the day, the single most important thing in any school, whether it's in a mainstream school, a special school, or residential school, is that children feel safe. It's a real firm contention of mine that, children can't learn unless they feel safe. If they're going to make challenges and they're going to try out new things, they've got to be frightened of not failing, which is one part, and a big part of that is about emotional safety. So I guess that raises issues to do with the rights of youngsters in school, and some youngsters preventing challenging behaviour stop the rights of other children achieving their full potential. So I don't have a problem around looking for youngsters being referred to alternative provisions around the inclusion in gender. And I think what Edward Timpson says there is really salient and really important. It shouldn't be that you're doubly disadvantaged because you go to an AP. As I said earlier, the best APs enhance the life chances of children. And I think that those are the provisions that we should be looking to refer children as and when they need to. Okay, so why engage with alternative providers? And can I say right from the outset, in my experience, when you engage early on, don't wait till you've reached the end of the line. The placements are often more effective and actually result in shorter placements in the AP. And that's not to say that there's a fixed time of how long children should or shouldn't be in AP. It really is down to the individual child and his or her circumstances. But when might you look at using AP? Well, it could be after a very serious event, and it may be that you need some cool-off period for a youngster or some youngsters. And I'm thinking then the context of, I can remember a school once referring 4 youngsters because they'd all been involved in a really, really serious incident. And so we had to very skillfully work out within the group. There were 3 APs. We had to very skillfully say, well, we're going to put 2 in one and 2 in another. So we actually didn't create the situation that had happened previously around them, being fighting, for want of a better word. I think when you've exhausted all of your resources, and can I say right from the outset again, that's not a blame thing. That's not saying you haven't done all the things you could have done. That's about saying you've recognised you've done everything you can do. You've looked at all the adaptations you can do, and you just need in your role you may need a break, but more important, you may need a piece of work being done with a particular youngster that needs to stop him or her being repeatedly suspended or even excluded. And I think sometimes it's appropriate for schools to say they want to use an AP to direct children to improve their behaviour. And again, I go back to that's not about being sent to AP. It's about saying that there's a piece of work that the AP needs to do. And I often used to say to colleagues when they came in or they were making referrals, what's the piece of work you want us to do? Is it you want us to teach this child how to self-regulate more appropriately? Is it you want this child to be less aggressive, i.e. teach them how to be assertive? So it's really being clear that you know why and to what end you're making use of AP. So what to look for? And I said, right from the beginning, the best APs to me enhance the life chances of children. And when in role, I used to think I'd want to provide a provision that was as good for the children who arrived as would have been the case for my own children. Thankfully, my own children didn't end up in AP. But if they had done, I would want to have thought that what we strive to provide was as good as you would have seen in any school. So there's a range of things that you need to look for, and I won't read all those lists, but I'll just pick out some of the main salient points. I think for me, that what we want children to learn, particularly around behaviour management, is self-regulation, and then being able to understand why they're behaving the way they do, and that may take a long time for them to do that, but actually give them strategies for managing that situation. So as and when they go back to mainstream school, they realise, one, what was not okay about their previous behaviour and acting out behaviour, but also they can marshal and use a range of strategies that will help them become more successful. I think you should be looking for APs that understand why children behave the way they do. And a big part of that will be about attachment and understanding that children behave in a range of ways because of a range of feelings. First come the feelings, then become the behaviour. And that doesn't mean to say we must accept inappropriate behaviour, but it says we need to try and understand why children are behaving the way they are in order to help them ameliorate some of their challenging behaviours. I think we need to be clear that we assess all the children's academic and medical needs. And I can think of an occasion where a youngster was referred to us, and quite quickly we could see that he was always sitting a certain way in the class. And guess what? We did the school nurse came in and did a test, and we found out he was hearing impaired in one ear, and that had never been picked up. And this was a lad who was 14. And guess what? We made arrangements to get that sorted out, and he was able to start making a much more academic progress, because guess what? He could actually hear what was going on. I think you need to be clear that AP needs to work very effectively with parents and carers, very much along the model of we're all in this together. It's not just the AP problem. It's not just the child's problem, the parents or carers' problems, or the mainstream school or the referring school's problem. It's all of us, and we need to be working this together. And I also think one of the other things you should be looking for is that the school has an outreach program, and I'll talk a bit more about that when we talk about referring youngsters back to mainstream. Okay, so we need to be looking at also this balance, and it is a balance between the academic needs of the child and the behavioural progress that they need to make. And I go back to the Edward Timpson quote earlier that there's no point in sending youngsters to AP if actually academically they're going to go backwards. What we should find is that as children's behaviour adjusts and becomes more appropriate, they make more academic progress. But there is a balance, and in day one you won't have children who want to buy in necessarily to a system that puts quite high demands on them around behaviour expectations. So there will be chances where there will be times where initially children may regress before they go forward. But as I say, in the best provisions, children will make inroads into managing their behaviour and make academic progress. I think it's also we need to understand that, and again, I don't want to get into the politics of the social construction of disability, but we need to be mindful that actually referring a child to AP is we're making decisions around their behaviour, and we're making judgments around how they're behaving. And in my experience, it should be that children are getting it wrong in the full myriad of their mainstream school experience, rather than in just some areas if you're looking to refer them to AP. And I can remember one particular youngster who we we weren't able to work with, and we said, no, we're not going to accept this youngster because his problem is only specifically in one subject area. All the evidence shows us that within other areas, he's making progress. So we felt that we could support the school in helping them around fixing an issue to do with this teacher. It wasn't even to do with the subject, it was to do with this teacher. So we worked on an outreach basis, supporting that school doing that. But so I think it's really important that we understand that we don't just manage children's behaviour in APs. What we try to do is make them, empower them to understand their behaviour, learn new skills and strategies so they can modify their behaviour and make progress over time. I think one of the great advantages of working in APs, the numbers of youngsters tend to be smaller. Although having said that, I've worked in a pro with 80+ children, and on a day when it was rock and rolling, that was as hard as any mainstream school, I would suggest. But I think the great thing that working with smaller groups affords us is more time to work in a multidisciplinary way, and I think that's one of the strengths of AP. They're able to harness and use the allied network agencies more effectively because they have more time, and I think that should be something you're looking for, and you're seeing how does the child get their needs met in a range of settings, be it therapeutic with the use of therapists, medically, say if they need medically, same with youth workers or probation workers, as may be the case with some youngsters. So that you can actually say the totality of the team around a child can maximise the impact and the resources that you're using. There'll be some times where some youngsters who are referred to AP may have EHC plans, and if that is the case, I would suggest the funding should follow that child. If he or she has got an EHC plan, it says that it's been deemed that that's there for a reason, and it may be that they need specific resources or specific ways of working with them that have financial implications. So to me, the funding should follow the child. A big part should be, if that is the case, that you're seeing that the individual needs are mapped and understood by the AP, and they know what it is that they're doing, and in relation to saying, yes, we can do the work around their behaviour, yes, we can do around about their academic ability, but we can also address their additional, or what some people call special education needs as well. And I think a big part of that is around, again, going back to this thing about recognising that we're all in this together, but also meeting regularly and celebrating achievements as well as things that may need to be adjusted and moved on. Okay, so how do you select a suitable alternative provider or providers? And I would say, in essence, it's very simple. You must visit. And I'm happy to be challenged on this, but my view is, I think it's a bit like going for an interview. You can't really know what a school's like just from its prospectus. I think you have to go into the provision to see what it looks like and how it feels. And I'd suggest it's the same for AP. You can't know what an AP looks like or feels like just because someone says, here's a report, or you look at their outcomes. So I think it's absolutely important that you go and visit. And you're clear then why it is you want to use this particular provider as opposed to a different provider. So I think if you're going to view a provision, I think you need to know what you expect before you go there. So I would contend in the APs that we ran, that you would come along and you would expect to see children learning. Well, no surprise there. You'd also expect to see sometimes children making mistakes in how they were behaved, but you would expect them to be challenged. As I often used to say to my colleagues, we're not responsible for how the children behave, but we are responsible for what we do around how they are behaving. So if children come to a provision with loads of inappropriately learned behaviour, our task there was to challenge it. And hopefully, if you came to one of the APs that we managed, you would see that, and you would see that people were being challenged where they got it wrong. Equally, I think you need to sit in on lessons and see that, to dispel some of these myths that still abound about AP, that children don't take part in learning activities. And I think you'd want to be looking at outcomes. How many youngsters do or don't go back to mainstream school? And I'll come back to that point about not going back a bit later on. But also, what are the outturns in relation to exam results? What are the attendance figures like? And, you know, how good is the quality of SEND support if need be for an individual youngster. It follows, of course, that safeguarding arrangements are really, really important. And I can remember a horrendous situation once where we, us and the referring local authority hadn't done our due diligence around it. And I just throw this example out. We were based in northeast London. We had a referral from a borough south of the river, and this was because a particular youngster had got into some difficulties with and some fights with some other children in a school in Bromley. So they said to us, "Look, we need to get this youngster educated outside of Bromley. Can you educate them for us? You know, in northeast London where we were?" And we said, "Yeah, we could look at that." And great. So 1 or 2 days went absolutely well. Our youngsters used to go into we were based within the campus of a local college in the AP, and the youngsters used to go into the canteen to have lunches in that provision. And all of a sudden one day, three I think it was the third day in, 3 police cars and a SWAT team arrived, and all hell was breaking loose because one of the children who was who'd been in this situation with this child in Bromley was actually attending the college in northeast London. So it just showed there that around safeguarding, sometimes you need to make sure you do extra due diligence, particularly if you're working with youngsters who are coming and travelling across different boroughs or different areas. If you're working outside of urban areas, you need to check the location, the environment, check school timings. You know, I know that we worked really hard to make sure that we started early but finished earlier as well, so that youngsters could leave the areas of where, so they weren't, you know, running into their colleagues from their previous schools at times. And I think you need to make sure that the curriculum offer matches your expectation. It shouldn't be that that as I say, that by coming to the pupil referral unit or the AP, that the children, the curriculum offer will disadvantage them. And I think the last one around reintegration is, I think there needs to be a named person from the mainstream school that's holding in mind that this youngster is attending AP. It shouldn't be out of sight, out of mind. So as and when you're thinking about looking for reintegration, you're saying there's a named person who we can contact so we can start looking at how that plan maps out. I think we should also be looking at gender balance. And I don't think it's appropriate to be sending, you know, young women into a particularly male-dominated environment. And likewise, I don't think it's appropriate to send young women into an environment which isn't balanced. So I think we need to be really mindful of that. I want to say something about age groups here, and this is a personal view. My own view is I don't think Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 youngsters should be educated on the same campus area, and where we worked, we did that slightly differently. And that's because pragmatically, some youngsters are referred to AP at the back end of year 11. And I think in many cases, under those circumstances, it's better to get those youngsters working as effectively as you can around getting them their exams, but also being mindful that to try and do the long-term work around behaviour amelioration is much more difficult in a short period of time, and you may only have, say, you know, something like 150 days in order to do that. So my own view is, I think, and because in context, I think some of the approaches you use at Key Stage 3 and primary are different than you might use at Key Stage 4. My own view, it's a personal view, is that I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's very difficult to have Key Stage 3 and 4 on the same campus. I think you need to be looking at break time arrangements. I've already mentioned social affiliations, and a big thing around local community interaction. And that in essence is in shops. And one of the most difficult periods for us to mediate in one of our APs was when a McDonald's was built 100 meters away from the provision. And it took us a long time, I think best part of 18 months, to actually mediate that transition and all the additional complexities of managing break times and after school times because of that. Okay, so you'd want to have you'd want to make sense. You'd want to hope rather that the AP that you're referring the child to is in many ways culturally aligned to your own system. So if you're referring children to AP because their behaviour is inappropriate, you'd want to you'd want to believe that within the AP they're being challenged around that inappropriate behaviour, but and the need for the expectations would be the same within a mainstream school as it would be in AP. And people used to say, "You're really naive. Do you really believe that?" And I said, well, I believe that the expectation should be the same. I don't know that we'd always get the same exam results, always get the model behaviour that we might have got if we work in mainstream. But I think as an expectation, I think absolutely in the AP setting, I expected the same, and in some ways more in certain areas for the youngsters than I would have done if I was working in the mainstream school. But I think you need to be absolutely mindful of that. And I can think of one case where a youngster had been referred to us, came from a grammar school, an all-boys grammar school, and he'd had no experience in his secondary school career around being around girls and young women. And we had to do a specific piece of work, both with his referring school and also with him, around recognising that there were different ways of speaking to young women than, say, to some of the boys who he'd spoke to. He just hadn't had any experience of it. So there was a specific piece of work that we had to do there to mean that we could be sensitive to both his needs, but also the needs of the boys and girls who were in the pro. I think it's really important as well that you can see that the AP is going to align with you around when it comes to reintegration, so that you're clear and be saying, actually, we want this piece of work to do, and actually these will be the success criteria or the key KPIs that we will be looking at to see this child is now ready to come back into our mainstream school. And there's no point in doing that if you refer to a child to an AP and there are odds with your vision or your expectations around children, how they should or shouldn't behave. So I've alluded already to there about high expectations around behaviour, and I think they just cannot be high enough, And I think a good starting point would always be, I'd say to you, you need to see children for how they can become rather than how they are behaving. And that's not always easy, particularly if you've got someone effing and blinding and spitting at you and thinking, actually, you can become a well integrated young man or young woman. Just at the moment, you're not doing that. So I think you must have high expectations. And I think one of the previous, one of the criticisms that was levelled at APs and people referral units was that the expectations weren't high enough. So hopefully we've moved from those days. Equally, though, although expectations have to be high, they have to be attainable. There's no point in setting up children to fail, particularly if they've got fragile self-esteem. And we'll talk a bit more about this in a minute, how we need to ensure that children, if they come to a pro, are successful. Because if they're not, then we need to be saying, why aren't they successful? And when do we need to look at other potential avenues? And I think by having high expectations, it's a way of showing children you care about them, and people say, oh, why? I can remember kids saying to me endlessly, saying, why are you on my case? Why are you doing so? I said, because I love you, I care about you. I want you to actually be successful, and you're not going to be successful if you carry on speaking to people like this. One of the things I said, one of the great things about working, in my experience in APs, were that we worked with smaller numbers, and I think because of that, that meant that routines were easier in many ways to get inculcated into our daily practice. And I'm a firm believer that routines that give children security, and they give them a sense of I'm okay here, I can be contained here, because this is why this is why they speak to me this way, or this is why we have the rules that say we finish classes at a certain time, or we eat a certain way in the dining room. So I think that the routines are a way of bringing around a safety for children, particularly when they've had a lot of dysregulation, both in their lives and perhaps say in their school careers. I can think of some youngsters who'd been in the old term, suspended and fixed term excluded so often that they'd never got into the routine of attending school early, and then that was a shock to them. Where in our AP, if they hadn't arrived by a certain time, we were on the phone, or someone was going out to go and collect them to bring them in. So I think that once they get into those habits and routines help set those habits, I think you are a big way of helping ameliorate some of their difficulties. Also think you need to think about things like grounded techniques. And here I can think of two younger children, two primary children who we work with. And one lad had an issue about being clean, and so he would often needed to wash his hands. So we worked around that, and moved to a position that as and when he went back to his mainstream school, he would come to us in the mornings, then go back to his mainstream school in the afternoon. The last thing he would do before he got in his taxi was to wash his hands. And equally, when he came to us first thing in the morning, he would wash his hands. And it was almost like that was for him one of a grounding techniques that he could understand. I'm going back to my mainstream school, or I'm coming into my other day school, as he called it. Equally, I can think of using transitional objects with young children, where they can take, and again, this is until they're secure enough within themselves, they can say, I'm taking this particular object, transitional object, with me from home to school, and then from school back to my mainstream school. So I think I'm a firm advocate of routines, and I would suggest to you, you should see routines as you would expect to see in any effective school, whether it's mainstream, special, or residential, dare I say. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about boundaries, and something I guess I'm saying this as a grandfather as well as a practitioner, that as I've realised as I've got older, is actually all children, particularly adolescents, will push against boundaries. And you could say, and I believe that's an integral part of the maturation process. And we need to be clear and make distinctions that is this child pushing against a boundary because he's out or she's out of control? Or are they doing this because it's just part of the natural process of saying, I'm going from being a boy to a man, or from a girl to a woman. And as part of that, I need to feel my way. I need to manage these hormones, and I need to be clear where the boundaries end. So I think that boundaries for all children, particularly adolescents, need to be really, really clear and consistent. And we'll talk a bit more about consistency at the moment. But it's so that the adults, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but the adults need to be in charge. The adults need to act as containers. They need to be able to absorb all the turmoil and some of the chaos that's around for these youngsters. And again, that's not to say that you say, I'm accepting behavior that's inappropriate. Absolutely not. But it's puts it in a context that you understand that unless someone's very, very highly disturbed, in my experience, they would rather choose to get it right than get it wrong. And so I think it's really, really important that we look at how we can put boundaries around youngsters. And I think the skill, particularly in AP and mainstream schools for older age children, is to put enough boundaries into place that the child never oversteps the final boundary. Talk a little bit about rewards here. And I think, one of the things that's, again, I think different around many APs I've worked in and been familiar with is the use of rewards. And it's for children who've not learnt appropriate behaviour, or have not had any success in their life. Rewards are one way of showing them that there is a link between getting it right and a reward. And equally, there's a link between getting it wrong and there being a consequence. So I have no problem with rewards and using rewards and consequences, as long as you don't move to a system where children become completely dependent on rewards and then say, well, I'm only going to do this if I get a reward. We have to foster intrinsic motivation in all youngsters, because in the real world, although I wouldn't work for nothing, the bottom line is it's the intrinsic motivation for doing the work that I do that makes me get out of bed in the morning, and children have to learn that. And I think a big part of that experience in AP is making children understand actually there are rewards for getting it right, just as well as there are consequences for getting it wrong. And I say it's around teaching youngsters that they can be successful. And that's part of the planning, particularly in the academic work, to make sure you ensure that they're being successful and they feel the benefits from achieving through the affective curriculum, for want of a better word. Okay, so we talked about rewards, and I alluded to briefly about consequences. If there was one line in my career I wish I had written, it was the Bill Rogers line. The certainty of the consequence is more important than the severity. And I think the absolute, bottom line is that consequences have to be consistent. And I know if Tom was here, he'd say, look, sometimes we have to make exceptions, but they have to be exceptions. You know, we should be looking at making children understand that if they get it right, there's a reward. If they get it wrong, or they do things that are not okay, there'll be a consequence. And that's the same for all of us. You know, if I drive too fast on the motorway and I'll get a speeding ticket. That's a consequence. So I think it does a disservice to children if we don't have expectations that teach them that in the real world, outside of school, in the adult world, there are always consequences for our behaviour. And I think it's also really important that we teach children how to get it right. If you've had a lot of failure at school and you've had a lot of unhappiness, you may manifest your behaviour in a way that's completely inappropriate. So we have to teach children how to get it right, and they need to learn that. And I think by doing that over time, and by providing person-made consequences, they can see that in the real world there's a follow-on. Having said that, you know, and this is the big part of the challenge for working with teenagers, life isn't fair, and we have to point that out as well. And that sometimes there'll be consequences which are not as any of us would have choose. But it should be that we offer children a range of consequences that are natural consequences to their behaviour. So they get something wrong, there's a natural consequence, not something that's arbitrary. Okay, so let's look at placing individual pupils. And I go back to the point I made earlier on. I think you must know the provisions that you're referring youngsters to. So in the last local authority I worked in, there were 15 different, at that time, 15 different APs, and they all offered something different. And I think the skill in making that judgment call around placing them was saying what was or what is the most appropriate AP for this particular child. So I think the first thing you need to do is look at that and be mindful that, you know, there will be cost implications for using AP, and in my experience, the most effective ones, unfortunately, cost the most as well. There's a correlation there. You need to carry out the risk assessments. And I go back to the comment I made earlier on that particularly if you've got situations where you've got gang members or you've got children who've had issues with each other in schools, you may consider, actually, if I've got two youngsters who we need to do a piece of work with outside of our mainstream school, that we don't necessarily refer them to the same AP. You need to make sure that children can actually benefit from looking at going to AP, and it doesn't always follow that they will do. You know, you may decide to use additional resources with it in-house as a way of doing that. You need to meet with the parents or carers and confirm that they're on board. And I stress the point there, you know, you can't force parents or carers to accept their child being placed in an alternative provision. In the best provisions, it works because parents and carers, the mainstream school, the AP, the allied network, multidisciplinary agencies all work together. I think it's really clear. You need to make it really clear what change it is you want to see so that everyone's clear about that. And there needs to be, as I said earlier on, a homeschool member, someone who's holding that child in mind as and when he or she is coming back to the mainstream school. And you need to look at dual registration, whether you do that for 1 or 2 terms or longer or shorter. But I think you do need to evaluate quite early on, and I would say it's about every 5-6 weeks, how successful is this placement being? And I can think of some placements where we'd set up something to run for 2 terms, and after 5 weeks, we didn't need to. You know, the youngster had made enough progress and had made some self-actualization progress, so they realised, actually, I think I'm going to be better off back in my mainstream school as long as I'm prepared to behave appropriately. And I need to look at KPIs as well, so that you're clear as and when you're ready to look at moving a youngster back to mainstream school. What does that look like? How would we know that they're ready? Okay, so now we need to look at how to achieve successful reintegration. And I think a big part of that is, I go back to this not out of sight, out of mind scenario. You know, if you refer a child to AP, that doesn't mean to say that's the end of the line for that youngster. You've got to be saying, let's sit down with the AP, let's look at what reintegration success criteria looks like. And that's a responsibility on both parts, both the mainstream school and the referring school. And successful reintegration happens because of a process. Moving on, the process looks something like this. the mainstream school has referred a youngster, and they've got clear expectations. And I guess I would add to that first bullet point, a uniform. And I can think of in some cases for in our APs that we insisted that children wore and the mainstream school did as well. They wore the uniform that came with their mainstream school. So as and when they were ready to go back to mainstream school, it wasn't a big shock. Oh, I've now got to start wearing a uniform again. I should say, my experience at Key Stage 4 is at times, particularly when youngsters had, less than 150, 100 days at school, we moved more to a dress code rather than a school uniform, because these youngsters would often not be going back to mainstream school. I think you need to be, parties need to be aware of how they'll provide transitional support. And I think a big thing there, I said about holding someone in mind, I think a big thing there was about, and I know this is a really labour intensive thing, but in my experience, the most successful reintegrations happened when there was a member of staff ready to actually pick up the child as and when he or she came back into their mainstream school. So in the case of some primary youngsters, it would be a member of staff would go on an outreach basis from the AP and then go and support that child, getting them back into their mainstream school. Or there would be a handover period where the member of staff from the AP on an outreach basis was meeting with their mainstream colleague and saying, right, here's Johnny Smith, here's Jackie Brown. They're now ready, they're coming in for the afternoon, or they're coming in for the day, or we're now looking at phasing them in. So I think a big part of that is being mindful of what needs to happen for doing that. And I think all parties need to be clear around just what needs to happen to ensure that we have a nice, clean and swift integration plan and it happen in practice. I've seen some of the mistakes we've made previously is I think we've not spent enough time planning to make sure that things were absolutely clear. And I can think of one example where a youngster turned up at school and the pastoral lead in the mainstream school had not let anyone know that there was a plan about how this child would be coming back, and it took a while to ameliorate the difficulties that came around about that. Okay, so there are some things you need to be mindful of in relation to using AP, and these are some of them are statutory requirements, and some of them are just make common sense. And I won't go through that list, but I would suggest to you that if you're using AP in the context of working it as a mainstream school, someone is going to be saying, "Are you getting for value for money?" Hopefully, it's yourself, but if not, definitely Ofsted will be doing that. And I think if you're saying you're taking money out of your school budget, mainstream school budget, and it'll be more than the actual usual amount of money you get for mainstream children to go to AP. Can you demonstrate that it was a worthwhile intervention? There's no point in saying I'm going to look to refer a child to an AP for 2 terms, and he or she comes back and there's no change. So I do think you need to be absolutely mindful that the provisions that you're using, one, are as good as they should be, and 2, that you're getting value for money. So, in summing up, can I just say, I said this from the very beginning, I really do believe the most effective APs can enhance children's life chances, and I think that's how significant they can be. They should do, because they've got the resources to do it, i.e., the biggest part of that, I think, is the smaller numbers and the use of multidisciplinary teams and lots of allied network agencies. So I'm confident in saying that when we did our best work, we definitely not only supported our mainstream schools in helping these children make progress, but also set those youngsters up for life. I think it's important to understand the wide variation of cost. But if you don't feel that you're getting value for money, then look for another AP. As far as possible, look to see that the cultural approach of the AP is similar to your own. It's going to have to be different in some ways because no 2 schools are the same. But it should be, if you say we insist that children, wear uniforms, that you broach that with the AP and say, in this case, if this youngster's coming back, he or she will need to have an expectation they're wearing uniforms. That's one example. You need to make sure that, particularly in relation to SEND, that and additional needs, that the AP can meet those needs as well. And you need to monitor attendance. The best APs would let schools know straight away if someone, if their attendance isn't what it should be. But I think it's really important that communication is clear from the outset. And you need to be really mindful of the DfE and Ofsted regulations in relation to the use of alternative provisions. So I don't know what your takeaways are from this, but what I hope they are is that you recognise that effective PRUs and AP can make salient inroads into ameliorating much of the inappropriate behaviour children do, partly because they've got the skilled staff and skilled multidisciplinary base to do that. And I think also I'd like to think that perhaps you can see there's something that mainstream schools can learn from AP. There's much that AP can learn from mainstream schools, but I think particularly in the context of behaviour management, there are some of the skills and strategies that are used in AP that I think would really be germane and can be useful for colleagues working in mainstream school. And I think that duality of looking at, say, a placement in a PRU to benefit both stakeholders can be something to be considered. And then finally, I just suggest you have a look at these three, particularly the most recent one around alternative provision improvement plans. Okay, thank you.